Hello and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Danny White at Python Media, and I have joining me today as presenters Katy Farmer, Developer Relations Manager at Lightstep, and Josh Soto, Vice President of Marketing at Lightstep. Welcome, guys.
Hey, thank you.
So today we're going to delve into the topic of observability. Please note that a recorded version of this webinar will be available shortly after the conclusion. I'm going to now pivot over to Katy, and she will take it from here.
Thank you so much. All right, today we are talking about observability, which can be a little scary, which is why we're giving this presentation. But first, let's talk a little bit about me. Okay, so hi, I'm Katy. I'm a developer advocate, and that means that my job is to represent the products I advocate to the world, and then also represent the users of that product to the company. So that means I have to know pretty much everything all the time, and when I don't know, my job is to find the answer. So that's why I'm here. You can contact me anytime. I use my email, my Twitter. And my co-presenter today is now going to introduce himself.
Yeah. Hi, everybody. My name is Josh Soto. Those are my two little weirdos that you see on the screen there. I'm VP of Marketing over at Lightstep. Super happy to join somebody that's smarter than me with Katy. So I'm going to cover some of the overarching concepts that we want to talk about today, but any real details, or if you've got questions on stuff that requires, I don't know, like a little bit more education, Katy's going to be our person to go
to. Great. So now we're kind of back at our main question for the day, which is, what is observability? If you're anything like me, then this word started appearing at work or maybe on like social media, in conference talks, and no one was telling you like what it was. So the first thing I want to do is go through some different definitions of observability. Starting with the most difficult one, but don't be put off, this is just foundational knowledge. So this term observability comes from the world of control theory, which basically exists in factories, chemical processes, this kinds of things. And what it means is how well internal states of a system can be seen from knowledge of its external outputs. And this means nothing to me. I don't know about you. Okay, but I think it's important to understand sort of where it comes from. This is important because sometimes it's impossible to see inside of a system. And that's mostly true for software. Just as it's impossible to see what's happening in a chemical distillation process, we need some way to know like what's going on. And this term kind of got traction in the site reliability community because in many cases they're trying to reason about a lot of different services, everything from APIs and various databases to third-party services. Establishing what's happening based on these small number of signals is a really important characteristic of a healthy system. So let's try this again. Like, what is observability? The sequel, the easier definition, right? These are its foundations, but like, what does it mean for us? The practical answer here is that observability is really the answer to a question. What is going on in my system? This is a hard question to answer, even in a traditional monolith. But even as we moved forward, distributed systems changed our ability to answer that question. Now we have to wonder, like, what is happening across services? What's happening across organizations? What's happening with every third-party service I hit? Or what's just happening with the team on the other side of the room? These are all tough questions, and this is the reason observability sort of matters to us and why we have to understand it. Most of us live in systems that are distributed to some degree, even if it's small, and that limits our ability to see what's going on. Okay, so here's the definition I think you should walk away with. We know where it came from, but Observability is the ability to navigate from effect to cause. And I think it's important to realize that I'm not saying this is a cause and effect relationship. On the outside, we see effects. We see an error, maybe. We just see a 404 we don't understand. And our job is to start with that effect and navigate all the way back to the cause. Sometimes there's more than one cause. Sometimes it's a lot of things kind of like compiling and then creating a problem. But for example, you might see a spike in errors and be able to navigate all the way back to just a simple misconfiguration. You might see increased latency, right? Like everything starts really slowing down, and then be able to trace it all the way back to, oh, my customers are actually doing something new. Like, wow, how did I not know that? Or you might just see complaints, right? You might see your number of tickets increasing, and then you might say, there's a deployment issue. This is the ideal. This is what we want to get from observability. We want to be able to get from effect to cause so that our lives are just, well, easier.
All right, so if I dig into like the way observability has been defined for this market, and I think it's still sort of a loose definition, but when we look at other vendors in the space, or sort of where the market's thinking is today, we really find that there's this sort of like, I don't know, this default mechanism where we say there's these three pillars to observability, right? So if we want to know if something's gone wrong, we'll sort of look at our metrics and say, okay, well, there's a spike here, there's a dip here. I understand that something has gone wrong. If we want to understand how it happened, then we sift through these like miles of logs to try to get to what the root of the problem was. And when we still aren't able to identify what the actual root cause was, in a lot of cases, we'll fall back to tracing. And so what we see is that there's this sort of mindset where we've got these three pillars of observability, and we call that observability when in fact it's really not. What we're looking at is three pillars of telemetry. And if I was really rude about it, I would say it's three SKUs that we could sell you, or that the industry can sell you to solve problems. But there's not a coherent strategy for how do we actually make sense of these things, collectively. So what does my system look like, all the way from the outside, all the way down to the individual service? How can I trace an issue from how it impacted the end user all the way back to the individual, like cause of an outage or cause of latency? And what we see is that metrics, logs, and traces, when treated as three independent things, actually don't provide the level of understanding that we need across these systems. And we're going to talk about why that is, and why that problem continues to sort of compound. And each of these, whether it's metrics, whether it's logs, whether it's traces, they really do have their own strengths, for sure. So we're not saying that there's not a reason to continue logging or to throw out your metrics vendor, but it's really more, how do you capitalize on these? And it's Lightstep's point of view that traces are really the backbone of observability, because they give you some context that you otherwise wouldn't have. And so let's talk a little bit, before I jump too far forward, I would say our CEO and co-founder does a really good job explaining sort of where three pillars thinking breaks down. I'd recommend, if you have time, go to watch that. And I think there's a link that gets sent out as part of this webinar, but I would recommend going back and watching his talk on three pillars, zero answers, and that's with Ben Siegelman. But let's talk a little bit about how did we get here, and why is this like this sort of latest evolution of thinking unseating this three pillars mindset. So what changed? And I'm in marketing, and you don't get away with like joining a company that's solving scale problems without talking about scale. But I will say we're not talking about scale in the sort of traditional sense where things just got bigger. What I want to do is sort of make a distinction between scale, the way that we commonly refer to it, and scale, the way that it impacts the development of these microservices-based architectures. And so when you think about the growth of any system, whether it's a system in an application or a waterway system like we're kind of looking at here, there's different types of scale. There's a sort of scale where if you add to something more of the same thing, it grows sort of proportionally with what you add to it. So in this case, if you add more drops of water to this puddle, it'll become a bigger puddle, it'll become a lake, it'll become an ocean. And that's looking at scaling wide. So we're really just adding more of the same thing, making the complexity of the problem sort of grow linearly. And that is not the type of scale that we're actually talking about when we talk about what we refer to as deep systems, and the scale issues that impact developers and developer velocity. So an example would be if you look at a village and we add another house to the village, another house to the village, it doesn't just become, cities are not just really large villages. You end up with all of these weird interdependencies where there's houses built on houses, and there's infrastructure, things to account for. So you end up with this really deep scaling problem where the complexity compounds on itself. And that's really what we're talking about when we talk about the shortcomings of this sort of three pillars mindset, where the scale issues are issues where you've got services that have dependencies on other services in ways that are really hard to see and hard to understand. So it's not just that you ended up with hundreds more services, you ended up with services that have these sort of layers of dependency beneath them. And that's what we refer to as a deep system. So any system that's got 4 or more layers of depth, we think of as a deep system. And that's where the ambiguity and obfuscation of actual problems really becomes an issue, and where logs and metrics and tracing do generally fall down when treated as sort of standalone things. So Katie's going to walk through a little bit of what that means and what the impact is for individual developers in those deep systems.
Yeah, thanks, Josh. I think it's really important to talk about the word scale, and like, it's so overused and often misused, especially like, you know, it's a big flashy sort of marketing word, like, does it scale, right? But like, you can scale in a lot of different dimensions. And this idea of scaling in complexity and becoming something new is really important in observability and in deep systems, because we know that observability is basically our ability to ask questions and find answers within our system. So what changes about that process when we have a deep system? So to sort of bring our metaphors back to the practical world of development, think about your job. You can control, you know, the code that you write, right? Like, I can sort of architect my piece of code however I like, but as our village sort of becomes a city, everything I do affects traffic, let's say, right? The things that I'm responsible for are so much bigger than what I can control. So every change I make now ripples out into a system that I might not be able to easily see or easily understand the repercussions. So let's focus on what deep systems sound like to us, to developers. They might sound like, where's Chris? I am dealing with an outage and no one else knows how to debug this. It might sound like, I didn't know that service was a dependency, because you all memorize all of your dependencies, right? It might sound like, it can't be our fault. The dashboard says it's fine. We all trust dashboards. Or even better, that was on a dashboard, but I can't find it.
Yeah, so I came in, when I first joined Lightstep, one of the things that I made a priority was going and listening to customers and potential customers of Lightstep sort of talk through what their pain points were, because I really wanted to understand like what we're hearing from the market. And I was shocked. There were a few things that sort of shocked me. And the first one was when you do have an outage, how do you know where to start? Not where do you start, but how do you actually know where to start in troubleshooting it? And what I found almost without any variance was we know where things have typically broken or what changes we've recently made. And so we'll start digging through the logs there first. And when you get into another layer of that, what you find is that folks are really kind of guessing on the best first place to start, and through no fault of their own. They just, it's so often that the level of observability that's needed to definitively pinpoint what the root cause of something is takes time. It takes considerable time. And whether it's scrolling through dashboards or sifting through logs, that time impacts development, and it impacts remediation. And the real cost of that approach is sort of felt. It's felt personally where you've got developers that are on call. There's a ton of anxiety about being on call. There's a lot of anxiety about shipping code at the end of the week or on a Friday. And there's a ton of like overall fatigue and finger pointing across the development life cycle. And you end up with teams sort of pitted against each other in organizations. And overall, like the experience to the brand is diminished. So you end up with latency or downtime that is difficult to pinpoint. All of that costs money. It's frustrating for developers, and the customers sort of pay the price. And this is especially true if you end up with systems that have like a real critical weight to them, where there's a lot of folks counting on that system to run seamlessly, and then you end up with outages that last 30, 40 minutes, an hour, or longer, and impacts all of the users. So what we really see is this lack of observability and a lack of an overall observability strategy that's really tethered to the entire system or thoughtful of the deep system has an impact across the entire business.
And I mean, there's some good news and some bad news, right? Which is that your application is getting deeper. There's a trend of moving towards microservices, towards these distributed systems. It's extremely unlikely that we're going to see a move back to the monolith, although that would be interesting. It's probably not where we're headed. And your application is getting deeper because of your stack. And I wish it was this kind of stack. This is just in here because I am a big fan of breakfast. There's really no other reason, but not this kind of stack. Your application, your software stack, right? So, and it doesn't matter if you're Python or Java or Ruby or what have you. I'm talking about the software you write and how it fits into the rest of your organization. How does it get used by other teams at your company or outside of it? Maybe your org has already migrated or even started just a little to move to microservices. Then you already know what I'm talking about, right? Your team and your services are kind of a cog in the machine. Maybe you have a diagram like this that tells you what your services look like and how they fit in. Maybe you're already building with Kubernetes or functions. But here's the thing. No one builds or deploys software in isolation anymore. It's, like I said, we're not moving back towards the monolith. We're moving towards these distributed systems. So even if you're not running on like the latest version of Kubernetes or developing using serverless, the chances are that you still have a deep system. There's still software in your stack that you can't control. It could be because you're building in the cloud, or it could be because you are using open source software. You could be using third-party APIs. No one builds without the help of these things these days. And all of these things, they lead to layers of distinct ownership. So maybe you own the services at the very top. Maybe you own software that's right in the middle. And I think that might be worse. It's pretty hard. But in any case, you've created these interdependencies. And this is what observability looks like. It's our ability to understand this sort of complex diagram so that you don't have to mental model it, right? Because that's a lot of like load just to keep in mind while you're working. You don't need to do that. What you need to do is focus on doing your job the best you can and trust that these things are observable. So that means that we have to think about observability in action. What does it look like? That means you need an observability solution. Great news, Lightstep is one. We got to that part of the presentation. So I think when we're talking about what's right for you, that's obviously subjective, right? You know your data and your system better than anybody else. But here are some things that sort of we think are the most important. You should be able to easily see and understand your distributed environment. You shouldn't have to be using that mental model of what you think it looks like. You should be able to go to an actual model of what it looks like. You should be able to immediately pinpoint performance regression. The minute something changes, you should know if you want to, and you probably want to. You want to be able to ship with confidence. Over time, if your teams continue to deploy and are on call, they have outages, they have bugs, they have complaints, deployments start to become really stressful. They start to become something the team is not looking forward to because they know it means late night calls or long hours. We want developers to be able to just ship and move on with their day. We also want to make sure that it's easy to share information. Because when we talk again about these distributed systems, how do we get information from the top of the pyramid to the middle to the bottom? And it is kind of a tough question, but it shouldn't be a single developer's job to figure that out. An observability tool or solution or platform should make this sharing of information easier. I also sort of really like this idea of context, because if you've ever been called in to help someone else with, a bug, something they've been struggling with, the majority of your time is spent getting up to speed because you don't have the context. And knowing the circumstances where something went wrong, knowing what services are involved, that's all context. It takes time. But if your observability solution could tell you those things, here are all the symptoms, here are the services that are involved, then you can save time not having to get up to speed in that regard and focus on, oh, this service I know has some issues. And really this boils down to the idea of insight. That's what we're looking for. We're not just trying to, stop outages or resolve errors. We're looking to really turn the data produced by our applications into valuable information. So those are the things I think an observability solution should do. And I think those are the things that Lightstep does. That's why I like it. So you should be able to see with Lightstep automatic deployment and regression detection. So that way, when you deploy, if something has gone wrong, or maybe not wrong, maybe just different. Most developers will probably know what I mean. Things didn't crash, but they're not going great, so they're a little unexpected. Those sorts of things are hard to pinpoint on your own and take a long time if you don't have the right tools. So that's what we mean by observability with context. Say, I'm beginning to see this strange, flapping dashboard when it comes to service A. And that's insight that you don't have without this kind of tool. You also have these super important system and service diagrams. Again, if it were up to me just to keep track of diagrams in my mind, I couldn't do more than 3 or 4 layers. I mean, I don't even know anyone's phone number anymore. I can't keep track of all of this, right? So in Lightstep, you should also see real-time and historical root cause analysis. And I know it's a bit of a trend lately where people are talking about how there is no root cause. And I think philosophically that's interesting, but sometimes there is. Sometimes there is a root cause and you want to say, oh, it's this third-party API that's misbehaving. I can work around this. You can also see correlations. And for me, when it comes to like really learning about your data, correlations are a really important way to do that. To notice like what parts of your system are correlated can teach you a lot about, you know, what that diagram actually looks like. You can also do custom alerting. I think getting an alert when things go badly is super important. Most people already have some kind of alerting built into their system, but I think that like the more nuanced logic you can put into alerting, then the more valuable the alerts become. And you don't have to worry about being alerted by things that you either can't resolve or, you know, can be resolved with a restart of a node. I also sort of subscribe to this mentality that no tool should be harder to use than the problem it solves. So like every tool I use as a developer, if the documentation's too hard, if the installation is too sort of like cumbersome, I'll move on. So Lightstep, I particularly think, and again, I do work here, but it's also my job to like tell you how good I think it is and receive your feedback. So just keep that in mind. But it's easy to set up and it's pretty agnostic, right? Lightstep is the observability platform, but you can send in telemetry from lots of different vendors. So we're not trying to lock you into like, oh, if you want to send logs in, you have to use, you know, whatever log vendor of your choosing. We want to make sure that whatever you already have in place, like, we'll just connect to it. And if any of you out there are worried about cardinality, because this tends to be kind of a niche area, the people who are worried about cardinality usually have cardinality problems, and people who aren't worried about cardinality are usually people who have literally never thought about cardinality. So if it's something you're worried about, don't. We have no limitations for you. And if you've never heard of cardinality, you don't need to start today. So this is what we call the Lightstep hypothesis engine. But in reality, this is a nice architecture diagram of how Lightstep works. So you can see all of the various places where telemetry might originate. Could be a monolith, could be your microservices, any client, right? And those all send telemetry to our satellites. This is a unique Lightstep satellite architecture. So basically, all of your telemetry gets sent to the satellites. The satellites keep 100% of your data. Then Lightstep performs its analysis on 100% of that data before it shows you any results. And the difference here is that a lot of tools don't analyze 100% or process 100% of your data. That's pretty common because of the sheer volume, but we think that you're going to be more accurate and happier with the results if you process 100% of the data. So that's really the takeaway for you here. This satellite architecture enables us to keep and process all of your data so that the predictions, the correlations, all of that is more accurate. Now it's time to talk about customers. Josh.
Yeah. So, okay. So when I love our customers, first of all. If you haven't had a chance to go to the Lightstep website, you can check us out at lightstep.com. You can see some of the customer testimony videos, including a couple that we're going to talk about now. But Twilio, I thought was a really interesting one. So when we first talked to the Twilio team, they said they wanted to identify traces of specific noteworthy events, and they were having an issue where their login vendor could solve the issue of what happened, where it happened, but not necessarily why it happened. And I guess I would think of that as like analogous to like, yes, the doctor's telling you, yes, your arm is definitely broken. It's broken right here, and we don't know why. When we talked to Twilio, the thing that they were really trying to get to was we don't want our developers spending all of their time that they could otherwise be developing features and rolling out code and really moving the business forward, spending a ton of time on building this really elaborate monitoring platform or solution. And so we need some help where we think tracing can solve that. Observability with tracing as its backbone can solve that. And what we found is that as we rolled out Lightstep in that environment for more than 40 core services that they wanted to continually be monitored without any real overhead on the service, is Twilio was able to go from this average MTTR time of 40 minutes down to about 3 minutes, which meant for the business, they were saving roughly 20 hours a week that developers were in this sort of wasteland of like looking and hunting at where problems were, and really slowing down the business, not to mention the impact that it had overall on a sense of velocity and this sort of confidence that you could ship code whenever and find out what was going to go wrong and really trace the regressions on it. So yeah, the net of it for Twilio was this huge reduction in MTTR, so 92% reduction in MTTR, and really an operational change to how they think about observability. And so it's been really fun partnering with Twilio on it. They've been a customer since early days. So that's one example, and then we'll jump into Under Armour, which is another example. And when I talked to Eric Wood over at Under Armour, who again, if you want to read the longer form version of this, you totally can on the site. The one thing that he said that really stood out to me was we did not want to have a culture where developers were afraid to ship code. They were afraid to be on call. We didn't want a culture where there was a sense that of sort of looming danger every time you roll out some sort of advance or some sort of code deployment. And so we wanted a solution that was going to allow us visibility at the systems level, so we could dynamically see how things were moving, and we could understand the system completely, but also at the individual service level. So if we had an outage in a service, we could understand exactly how to remediate that in an individual team, and understand what the impact was from one team to another. And for Under Armour, Lightstep is sort of the canonical use case for chasing that stuff down, and really is the only observability platform that allows for that system level visibility at a macro and micro level. And we've become a pretty integral part in how Under Armour operates just day in and day out. And so I highlight those two because I think that the big impact for them, of course, it's felt in MTTR and tracing root cause for any individual event. It gives more confidence in deploying code, but I think it also it changes what it feels like to be a developer. It's never been our opinion at Lightstep that observability should be this like obtrusive, in-your-face process, and too often it is that. It's if something goes down, you're sifting through logs, you're committing time and hours to it. You've got anxiety around what's going to work and what's not. It's our opinion that this should just naturally fit into the way that you work. You should have system-wide visibility when you need it. And when you're focused on building features, you should just be able to focus on building features without having all of this overhead of multiple pillars and multiple vendors and multiple things and tabs and stuff to sift through, which can be chaotic. So that's two. We've got plenty more, but just for the sake of brevity, I just wanted to highlight those two to give a little cleaner sense of it. And then this is my strong pitch to say, if you're curious about what observability could look like and what does Lightstep actually offer, how can you get into some of the use cases and understand Lightstep? How can you get your hands on the product without like committing to like this arduous POC or sales cycle or something you want to be a little bit more anonymous? I would say jump into the sandbox today. The sandbox allows for you to really then experiment with Lightstep's data as opposed to your own, and within 5 or 6 minutes have a really clear understanding of what you're able to see and what you're not able to see. And so it's an interactive sandbox where you can jump in. I strongly recommend, if you heard nothing else that we talked about today, or this is all very fuzzy and not easily understood, go to the sandbox to just get your hands on what observability looks like from Lightstep's perspective, and really what it could look like transformationally to the way that your developer workflows happen today. So that's my hard pitch for you to go to lightstep.com/play. Katy, if you want to say more, I would say jump in.
Yeah. I mean, I want to echo that. Like, even if you heard a lot today and you were like, oh, this is so over my head, the first thing I did when I was sort of like heard of Lightstep was immediately go to this like interactive piece, because I think, especially if you're not sure, like, still, like, what does observability mean? What can I get from it? Even if you don't know anything and you just go to the sandbox and click around, you will learn something about observability. You don't get to try products like this hardly ever. They're so kind of like abstract that I think it's really unique. And for me, it was like kind of a deciding factor in that I knew I liked this company because they have this like interactive tool. So
Yeah, I'm not afraid to show it off. The other thing is, if you, let's say you were on our sandbox 2 or 3 weeks ago, check it out again. They're continually making updates and individual use cases that you can walk through. So yeah, that's my hard pitch to go to sign up for Lightstep Sandbox. Hopefully it's not too overbearing.
This is our only overbearing slide.
Oh, cool. Yeah. All right. That's my call to action for everyone.
Yeah.
And now I think we open it up for some Q&A.
That's it.
Awesome. A very interesting presentation on observability. We do have a couple of questions. Is there an OSS component of Lightstep?
You bet there is. Thank you for asking. That's actually my area of specialty.
All right.
We help develop and support open telemetry, which is a sort of newish. It's in alpha. It is supported by the CNCF, and basically it is a standardization library so that everyone who is tracing can adhere to some of the same standards so that there's less confusion. I think everyone should go check it out. It's like, because it's in early phases, it's a really interesting time to like go see the discussions happening about how we're making decisions. It's across a lot of communities and companies. We are certainly not the only ones working on it. Yeah, and if you go to the Lightstep blog, you'll see a specific open telemetry section. You can read all about it.
Awesome. So second question, what's the difference between APM and observability?
That's a fun question. I think if you think about APMs, this is what I think of as more traditional monitoring. You kind of, in most cases, have to know what you're looking for. This is really the difference between like monitoring and observability. Monitoring tools, if you say, I need to measure my CPU usage on my laptop because I know that when I play Minecraft, it goes bananas. But observability is really the idea of like, I don't know exactly what I'm looking for, but I know that like I need information about my system. So an APM is a good traditional tool. It certainly like has its place. But if you're looking for this like more complete view of your system, it's just not going to be enough.
All right. Any final thoughts or insights that you think users or listeners would like to know about Lightstep? Obviously, they should go to the link so that they can go to your sandbox.
Josh?
I think, I mean, I'm always intrigued by the brainpower that we were able to sort of pull together, like within Lightstep. I think having our CEO and our founders come from like these systems that were just at massive scale, you know, including like being like 3,000 employees at Google, and seeing, you know, where a lot of these monitoring and observability solutions eventually fall down, has really been interesting for me. There are times when it feels like we're sort of traveling back in time and trying to describe something that hasn't, you know, some of these challenges that folks haven't run into. It can be a bit prophetic at times. Like I had a conversation with a large service provider who said that their logging solution had hit a point where they were literally going to have to say no to adding logs because of cost, and because the time to root cause analysis was just unwieldy. And it was a conversation where he said, "You told us this was going to happen 6 months ago, and now here we are, we're having that issue. What do we do?" And so for me, that's been sort of the proof point that, you know, we're definitely tapping into, you know, a problem that folks feel very viscerally. So I think that's an interesting side of Lightstep. Oh, and our CEO plays a banjo, so I guess that's another thing.
Awesome.
I just would add that, like, if this all feels over your head, don't worry. It's early days. Observability is kind of just hitting its stride. If the vocabulary and some of the definitions we shared don't quite make sense to you, then like that's totally normal. I have worked very hard to understand these definitions. And I think that like it's observability is for everyone, regardless of whether you sort of like understand every detail of it. It doesn't lessen its impact, and we're working to make the tools like easier to use all the time. That's one of my personal goals for the company and for open telemetry. So that's all.
Awesome. Well, guys, thank you for this very interesting presentation. You can go to lightstep.com/play to get started in the system. Also, there will be a recording of this webinar that will be available shortly, and those who have signed up, you'll get that by email. Thank you so much, guys. We appreciate your time today.
Thanks, Danny.
Bye.